Define your boundaries to redefine your relationships. Welcome to the Creativity Cure. This is, I believe, episode 7 or 8. I believe it's 7. Welcome. I'm Bethany Joy, and I am the owner of Bethany J Photography. I'm a fine artist in Maryland. And on this podcast, I help women and creatives cultivate the skill of creativity by sharing what I've learned as an artist. And I also like translating some of these design principles into practical, everyday application. So we've been on a series called Think Like a Designer, and I want to continue talking about this process. So when I started this podcast, my goal was to make design more accessible because I know how powerful good design is and how paramount good design is to our daily lives. And I want to share some of that thinking with you. And so we've been discussing a process called design thinking, where you use 5 steps to rapidly solve problems. The steps are to empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. We started with empathizing, and now we're talking about defining. So before a designer creates a product for users, they first understand what the end user is going through. And we talked about how we can understand ourselves through self-compassion and others through empathy. Then we talked about what artists do next, which is they define problems. Now, last time we talked about defining problems in terms of when we know that something is wrong, but we don't necessarily know what to do. And I also talked about how defining a problem is a lot like addressing the foundation before painting the walls of your house. You want to not just jump to solving a problem without being sure you're solving the right problem. And also I talked about how it's really normal to have seasons in life where you know something's wrong, but you can't necessarily define what is wrong. And that's natural. And so I talked a little bit how you can work through those things using a couple of chapters from the Personal MBA. And so today I want to talk about how we can define our boundaries and along the way redefine our relationships. So let's talk about defining problems in terms of solving problems with others and externalizing it. How do we become good problem solvers in a world where there are millions of us with millions of different opinions, but we all have to work together to enjoy life, you know? We need each other. And if you're human, you're going to run into a situation where you have a problem with someone. So I could go a lot of directions with this, but I'm keeping this episode pretty short. And I want to focus on a phrase that I said a couple times. It's really something I picked up by reading Never Split the Difference. So what he says continually in that book is to keep the problem. And by that, he means that we can very easily get caught up in power struggles or ego struggles with people trying to prove things that have nothing to do with actually solving the problem. What I mean by that is what may start out as a collaborative work project can easily become a competition for who is, more impressive at their craft. In an argument, it can go from trying to solve a communication issue to trying to prove that you can get the last point in and inflict the most damage. So I want to talk about today defining your boundaries first so that you can redefine your relationships. To me, an unnecessary, undefined conflict comes when I fail to verbalize or communicate what's in my head. I also see issues come when I assign motives and ideas to others that they have not actually communicated to me. And this can happen to you as well if people are assigning motives to you that you've never communicated. but maybe it's because of things they've experienced, maybe because of the past. They are, and they're applying things to you that may not be true. So I saw it was on Instagram. I thought it was really funny. And someone was like, listen, until you say we have a problem, we don't have a problem. And what I loved about that is instead of relying on maybe being petty, maybe punishing people by excluding them or freezing them out or isolating them, it's getting straight to the root of it, is that at the end of the day, you need to know what your boundaries are, and you can only help work with others when they're willing to communicate what their boundaries are or what they need from you. And until that happens, you're relieved of the responsibility of trying to figure out what's in their head. I remember my mom used to say all the time, it's none of your business what people think about you. And I think about that now because it's true. People are allowed to think what they want. I don't have to spend my life worrying about their thoughts, unless they communicate it to me, like that Instagram post said. Unless you say we have a problem, we don't have a problem. So the reason I'm talking about setting boundaries is because when we set boundaries, we take ownership of our behavior. We own what we will do in any given situation. And the truth is that we can always control our response, but we can't not control other people's actions. So by focusing on defining our boundaries and how we will respond if someone crosses them, we begin to start to develop a true sense of what we can actually control, and B, we start to focus on what actually matters to us. When you're not trying to prove yourself to somebody who's not willing to communicate with you. So if someone's crossing a boundary repeatedly, at some point it's because you're not enforcing the consequences that you set for when people cross that boundary. And to me, holding boundaries is not about being mean. It's about defining where you end and where others begin. And it allows you to enjoy relationships because there's mutual respect. And when there are no boundaries, you end up with frustration, miscommunication, and chaos. And there really doesn't have to be this negative experience. For me, sometimes problems arise between people because I am allowing my boundary of being defined by what I assume others think be crossed. So if I think someone thinks I'm lazy or unreliable, and the truth is that it's really something I think about myself that I'm not addressing in myself, I'm avoiding the problem of addressing myself. And also I'm trying to prove myself to somebody who I really don't know what's going on in their head unless I ask. That's why boundaries are important. So if you want to redefine how you interact with people and communicate, it begins with listening and understanding yourself, with having preferences and opinions, and understanding. I saw this the other day. You're going to be the villain in someone's story. You're going to say no. You're going to say no because you have boundaries. The more you uphold those boundaries, the more you stand up for them and define them, I believe it actually brings a sense of freedom, because the people who are around you will respect your boundaries. And if they don't, you know that maybe they're not necessarily the best person to be around. Another reason you want to uphold your boundaries is because you learn the value of disagreeing without being disagreeable. And upholding boundaries doesn't mean being rude or selfish, but it does mean clearly stating what you want. And it means that when you do come to moments where you disagree with others, instead of caving in because you want to avoid conflict, or avoiding because you want to avoid conflict, or immediately going to be combative, if you're regularly expressing and setting your boundaries, you may early on avoid setting up situations where people are crossing them. It's like I said earlier, how you behave is who you attract. How you treat yourself is how others will treat you. So if you regularly allow yourself to let people do things, say things, continue behaviors that you find inappropriate, then it's going to continue to happen. But as you set those guards up for yourself, then you begin to shape your world so that what's going on around you is not regularly letting people trespass on what you need. Also, I want to talk about how when we set boundaries, we begin to build healthier relationships, and we also are really taking our own life into our hands instead of letting others' emotions, others' traumas, others' frustrations drive our decisions. I know there are plenty of times, especially if you've ever worked in customer service, you're going to run into people who are having a bad day. I mentioned this before. And you can let whoever walks through the door decide what the kind of day you're going to have. But when you set the boundary of, hey, regardless of what day I have, I don't allow people to speak to me that way, then it becomes about, hey, I'm going to keep my boundary and we can problem solve. But if we're going to continue to cross that boundary, then I'm going to step away from the conversation. And so by setting your boundary, you're keeping the focus on what's actually important. When you set up your boundaries, you put up your own wall of protection to continue enjoying relationships you have, because you're no longer doing it out of obligation or a transactional attitude. You're now engaging in everything you do with purpose because you're being genuine and honest of who you are. And like I said, first you start with finding your boundaries. Like, what matters to you? What are your values? What's important to you? And the way that you define those, you can go back and listen to the last podcast. I would say you put real practical actions to what it means. Respecting you is a very vague term, but if respect to you means not taking credit for something you've accomplished, then I would write that down as a value, is that I want to be clear when I accomplish something that I get the right value, that I get the credit for it. It might mean that respect is communicating plans ahead of time as well as possible so that I can plan out my day or make sure that I can be there for you. So in conversation, once you've defined those values and you're clear on what's important to you and what you will do in response to people not following that, you begin to see that life is really full of, I think for one, you begin to see life is full of possibility. And for two, I think you build confidence in yourself in the sense that you don't need to allow mistreatment to maintain the life you have. That's like a false belief you can have, is that if I set a boundary and say no and someone doesn't like it, I'm going to be all alone. I'm not going to have friends. You may miss out sometimes, but you'll also gain peace. You'll also gain, honestly, a clear understanding of who around you is really willing to work with you. Even if you disagree with those people, if they're willing to respect your boundaries, there's room to work and grow. And those are the kinds of people you want to attract to yourself. And if you're trying to live authentically and not live through the lens of other people's opinions, you really have to listen to yourself and understand what's important to you. And also in doing so, I think that you'll be more open to actually understand and listen to those around you. If you are somebody who struggles with setting boundaries, I'm going to wrap up this podcast because it's a really short one today. But I would recommend listening to this one podcast that I'm going to pull up on my phone right now because I listen to it all the time and I've found it super helpful. It's the Dr. John Delony show. And I love what he does because he helps people to accept their past and define their future and accept difficult situations. And I think if you listen to that show, he gives a lot of practical insight on dealing with difficult situations like divorce, dealing with separation in marriage. He talks about dealing with difficult parenting relationships, betrayal. He covers it all. And he really does go into the space of defining your boundaries and redefining your relationships and how to really stand up for yourself and do that. So I recommend you go listen to that. I am going to dip out real quick right here, but if you got anything from this, I thank you for joining me. Again, I'm Bethany Joy. I'm a fine artist, and I like to come on here every other week. Sometimes I do a long podcast, sometimes it's short, but either way, I'm inviting you to just think like a designer. And what that means is, like, let's be creative in how we approach our life. Let's invite ourselves into a growth mindset, and let's focus on being the best that we can be. I want to encourage you that if life is hard right now, if you're struggling creatively, I have something for you. I have created 2 resources to encourage you. The first one is 30 affirmations for confident creativity. And the second one is a checklist to know if you are in the confident creativity space. What these 2 resources are the things that I needed when I was struggling with finding who I was again as an artist. And I believe that being creative is not just for the sake of making money. It's not just for the sake of producing for other people's enjoyment. I think that creativity is healing. I think it brings flourishing. And I think that play is an important part of life that really we miss as adults. So if you're not sure where you're at, and you used to be a creative person, you used to paint, used to draw, used to write poetry, used to sing, maybe you've started a lot of businesses, maybe you used to be creative in travel, or maybe even in your physical expression through an extreme sport. If you used to really express yourself and you find yourself out of it, I want to invite you to check out these resources. You can do so by following me at BethanyJPhotography.com, or click the link below and you can take the quiz. Or you can always just reach out to me on my website, and I will send any of them over to you. But one of the resources is for encouragement. Maybe you are anxious and you just need encouragement that you can start again, that you can be vibrant and alive and full of energy no matter what's going on around you. You don't have to give that up in order to live life. The second resource is for those of you who are practical. It's a checklist. And if you check it off, it's going to give you some practical ways that you can begin to invite creativity back into your life and get back on track. So check those out. Check out my website. I am always open to talking to you, and I would love to have a podcast guest on for later in the year. So please send me that. And the last thing I'm going to say is, I know there are so many of you who are creative. Please, if you are in Maryland, I want to hear your story. So subscribe to Seen and Celebrated, the weekly newsletter I send out, where I share about local creatives. I really want to support, especially women in Baltimore, Maryland. I want to build a community where I give back and where we help each other, learn who's really around us, who's in our community that we can support, and also where we can share our creativity together. So thank you for joining me. My name is Bethany Joy, and this has been The Creativity Cure. See you again.